I stayed. I loved my husband. That is the hardest sentence I have ever had to say out loud. Because loving him is what kept me from seeing what he was doing and what he had been doing for a very long time. My name does not matter as much as my story does. What matters is that I was 73 years old when I found out that the man I had built my entire life with had been quietly, carefully, legally dismantling everything we owned together and handing it to someone else. What matters is that I was sitting at my kitchen table in Dayton, Ohio, on a Tuesday morning in February, drinking coffee and looking out at the yard where my grandchildren used to chase fireflies, when I opened a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. My husband and I had been married for 44 years. We met in 1979 at a church potluck dinner. He was 26. I was 24. He had kind eyes and a laugh that filled whatever room he was standing in, and I fell in love with him before the evening was over. We married the following spring and moved into a small apartment in Kettering. And for the first few years, we were genuinely, simply happy. We didn't have much. He was managing a small hardware supply company, and I was working as a dental hygienist 3 days a week. But we saved carefully, and we talked about everything, and we had 2 children by the time I was 30, a son and then a daughter, and life felt the way life is supposed to feel when you are young and you believe in the person sleeping next to you. In 1989, my husband's father passed away and left him a modest inheritance. Not a fortune, about $60,000. But my husband had an idea he had been carrying for years. He wanted to open a diner. Counter seating, homemade pie. The kind of place that stays open until 2 in the morning for the people who need somewhere warm to sit. I said yes without hesitating. I had been saying yes to his ideas my whole adult life, and most of them had been good ones. We opened Carver's on a Saturday in March of 1991. I named it after the street it sat on. He ran the kitchen. I handled the books, the payroll, the vendors, the licensing, every piece of paperwork that came through the door. We worked 6 days a week for the first 3 years. And slowly, steadily, it grew. By the late 90s, we had regulars who came every single morning. By 2005, we had expanded into the space next door and added a proper dining room. By 2015, Carver's was valued, according to a business appraisal we had done for insurance purposes, at just over $2 million. We had built that together. Every dollar of it. Every early morning and every late night and every argument over suppliers and every holiday we spent behind the counter instead of with our families. We built it together. And I never once thought to question whose name was on the paperwork, because the paperwork was something I handled. Or so I believed. I need to stop here and tell you about my sister, Carol. Carol is 4 years younger than me, and she has always been, as she describes herself, the loud one. She lives in Columbus, about an hour away, and for 40 years she has been calling me every Sunday without fail. She called me the Sunday after my wedding, and the Sunday after my mother died, and the Sunday after each of my children was born, and she has never missed a single week. Carol is the kind of person who notices things. She noticed, before I did, that my husband had become distant in the years after he turned 70. She noticed, before I did, that he had started taking phone calls outside on the back porch. She noticed, before I did, that whenever I mentioned the business finances, he found a reason to change the subject. I told her she was imagining things. I want to tell you that I had some instinct, some quiet knowing, some moment where I looked at my husband across the dinner table and understood that something was broken between us. But the truth is that I did not. The truth is that I trusted him the way you trust a wall. Not because you've tested it recently, but because it has always been there, and you have stopped seeing it at all. The letter came from a law office in Cincinnati. It was addressed to me, which was the first strange thing. It was from an attorney whose name I didn't recognize, and it informed me, in careful legal language, that a claim had been filed against Carver's Diner LLC regarding an outstanding vendor invoice, and that as a named party in the operating agreement, I was being formally notified. I read that sentence 3 times. Carver's Diner LLC. I had never heard that name in my life. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Then, I went to the filing cabinet in the hallway, where I kept the business records. The cabinet I had organized myself. The cabinet I had maintained for 30 years, and I started going through folders. The original partnership documents were there, filed neatly in 1991. The incorporation papers from 2003 were there. The insurance certificates, the health inspection records, the vendor contracts. All of it, exactly where I had put it. But there was nothing with the word LLC on it. Nothing that matched the name in that letter. I called the attorney's office and identified myself. The woman who answered put me on hold for a long time. When the attorney came on, he was cautious. He asked me to confirm my name and my relationship to the business. I told him I was a co-owner. There was a pause that lasted longer than it should have. He told me that the operating agreement for Carver's Diner LLC listed 2 members, my husband and a woman whose name I did not recognize. I asked him to repeat that. He did. I thanked him, and I ended the call, and I sat in my kitchen, and I looked out at the yard for a very long time. That night, I did not say anything to my husband. I made dinner, and I sat across the table from him, and I watched his face, and I tried to understand how a person who looked so familiar could be a stranger. He talked about a supplier who had raised prices. He asked about our daughter's upcoming visit. He ate everything on his plate, and he rinsed his dish, and he went to bed at 9:30 the same way he always did. I called Carol at 10. I told her everything. She was quiet in a way that Carol almost never is. And that quiet told me more than anything she could have said. When she finally spoke, she said, "Find out everything before you say a word to him. Everything. Bank records, tax filings, property records. Find everything first." She was right. I had spent 44 years being the person in our marriage who managed the paperwork. And now I understood that I had been managing the paperwork I was given access to. There was another set of paperwork I had never seen. I contacted an attorney the following Monday. I found her through a colleague of Carol's, a woman named Patricia, who had spent 20 years handling complex asset cases in Ohio. When I sat across the desk from her and laid out what I knew, she did not seem surprised. She asked me detailed questions for almost 2 hours. She asked whether I had ever been listed as a co-signer on the business accounts. I said I believed so. She told me to pull every document I could find and bring it back within the week. What Patricia's team uncovered over the following 6 weeks was something I still have difficulty describing without my hands starting to shake. The LLC had been formed 3 years earlier, without my knowledge or signature. The formation documents listed my husband as managing member and this other woman as a secondary member with a 49% stake. Because Carver's had been originally incorporated as an S corporation, with my husband listed as the primary officer, something I had never scrutinized because I handled the day-to-day bookkeeping, not the corporate structure. He had been able to reorganize the ownership into an LLC through a conversion process that, in Ohio, does not automatically require spousal consent when the business is categorized as separate property. Here is where I have to explain something, because I did not understand it myself until Patricia walked me through it. An LLC, or limited liability company, is a type of business structure. The reason it matters in a divorce situation is that once assets are moved into an LLC, the ownership of those assets belongs to the LLC, not to the individuals involved in the marriage. If the LLC was formed without my name on it, then legally, under certain arguments, The business was no longer marital property. It was the LLC's property, and the LLC's members were my husband and another woman. Patricia told me that the conversion had likely been structured specifically to make Carver's appear to be my husband's separate business asset rather than marital property. It was, she said, a method she had seen before. Not common, but not rare either. I asked her whether what he had done was legal. She said that was exactly the right question, and that the answer depended on several things she needed to verify. Had he used marital funds to sustain and grow the business after the LLC conversion? Yes, the joint account had continued to make vendor payments. Had I contributed labor and management to the business during that period? Yes, I had worked there 3 days a week until 2 years prior when I had stepped back due to a knee surgery. Was there documentation of my historical role in the operation? Yes, payroll records, emails, vendor correspondence, all of it in my name. She told me that we had a strong case for arguing that the LLC conversion did not sever my equitable interest in the business, and that the attempt to restructure ownership without my informed consent or participation constituted financial misconduct. I asked her one more question. I asked whether she knew who the other woman was. Patricia paused. Then she told me that the woman had been employed as a bookkeeper at Carver's for 11 years. I had hired her myself. I will not describe what the next several days felt like. I do not think there are words that would be precise enough, and I do not want to be imprecise about this part. What I will say is that Carol drove up from Columbus the Friday after I found out and sat with me in my kitchen for 2 days straight. And that without her, I am not certain I would have gotten through it with the clarity I needed. She brought food. She let me talk, and then she let me be quiet, and then she made me eat. On Saturday evening, she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "The worst thing he could have done is not what you're imagining. The worst thing he did was spend 44 years making you believe you were equal partners while making sure you weren't." She was right. That was the thing that cut deepest, not the betrayal of the affair, though that was its own wound. It was the betrayal of the paperwork, the deliberate, patient, methodical way he had restructured our shared life so that when the moment came, I would have nothing in writing. I went to see my husband after Patricia had filed the initial petition. He was sitting in the living room when I came in. He looked up and his expression shifted not to guilt exactly, but to something I can only describe as calculation. He knew. Of course he knew. Patricia's filing had been served that morning. He told me I was making a mistake. He told me that the business had always been his vision, his work, his inheritance that started it, and that what he had done was simply protect an asset he had built. He told me the children would understand that. I asked him whether he had considered, at any point in 3 years of planning this, that I might find out. He said he had assumed I would accept it. I looked at him for a long moment. This man, with the kind eyes I had fallen in love with at a church potluck in 1979. This man who had eaten dinner across from me for 44 years. This man who had assumed, after all of it, that I would simply accept it. I told him I would see him in court. I want to tell you about my children, because they are the part of this story that took the longest to heal. My son called me 4 days after I filed. He had spoken to his father. He was careful on the phone, measured in the way that told me he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. He told me he hoped I would consider the full picture. He told me his father was 75 and had health concerns I might not be fully aware of. He told me that a prolonged legal dispute could be damaging for the whole family. I asked him whether his father had mentioned the LLC. There was a silence. I asked him whether his father had mentioned the 49% stake belonging to a woman who had worked for us for 11 years. The silence continued. I told him I loved him and that I would talk to him again when he was ready to hear the full picture, and I ended the call. My daughter was different. She called the same day, without knowing I had already spoken to her brother, and she cried. She said she didn't know what to believe. She said she was scared. I told her that was fair and that she didn't have to take sides, and that I would be all right. She is the one who eventually came back first. It took time, but she came back. My son did not speak to me for nearly 8 months. Patricia's case rested on 3 arguments. First, that marital funds had been consistently used to operate and grow the business after the LLC conversion, making it a marital asset, regardless of its corporate structure. Second, that my documented contributions, labor, management, vendor relationships spanning decades, established an equitable interest that could not be extinguished without my consent or compensation. Third, that the LLC had been formed with the specific intent to deceive me ahead of a planned divorce, which constituted fraudulent transfer under Ohio law. To support the third argument, Patricia brought in a forensic accountant. A forensic accountant is a specialist who examines financial records specifically to detect fraud, hidden assets, or deliberate misrepresentation. What this woman found in my husband's personal accounts, his business accounts, and the LLC's filings was a pattern of transfers that had begun almost exactly 4 years prior transfers that moved money incrementally out of joint accounts and into accounts I had no access to or knowledge of. The total amount was just over $380,000. The case did not go to trial. 6 weeks before our scheduled court date, my husband's attorney contacted Patricia with a settlement proposal. Under the terms, I would receive a buyout payment representing my equitable share of Carver's at current valuation, which had been independently assessed at $2.4 million plus a settlement for the transferred funds, plus my legal fees. I asked Patricia whether she thought we could do better at trial. She said possibly. But she also told me something else. She said my husband had been diagnosed with a cardiac condition 4 months earlier, that his health was declining, that the litigation stress was, according to his own medical documentation submitted in the case, a significant risk factor. I sat with that information for several days. Carol and I talked about it on Sunday. She did not tell me what to do. She asked me what I actually wanted, not what I was entitled to, but what I wanted. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about being 24 years old at a potluck dinner. I thought about 30 years of early mornings at Carver's. I thought about the filing cabinet and the folder I had kept so carefully for decades. I thought about what it means to stay in a marriage for 44 years and discover, near the end of it, that the person you stayed for had been making plans to leave you with nothing. I told Carol I wanted it to be finished. I accepted the settlement. The total came to just over $1.3 million, plus fees. It was not everything I might have won. It was not, in some sense, justice in the fullest meaning of the word. But it was mine. It was real. It had my name on it, and no one could restructure it into an LLC without my knowledge. I signed the papers on a Thursday. My husband died 11 weeks later. It was his heart, as the doctors had warned. He died at the hospital, and I was notified by my son, who called me sounding younger than he had in years, not calculating or measured, just scared and sad in the way that a child sounds when they have lost a parent and they suddenly need their other one. I drove to the hospital. I sat with my son and daughter in a waiting room with fluorescent lights and a vending machine that hummed too loudly, and I held both of their hands. I did not go to the service. That was my choice, and I have made my peace with it. What I felt in the days after his death was not grief in the simple sense. It was something more complicated, a grief for the man I had believed I was married to, for the version of our life I had carried in my mind for 44 years, which had never entirely matched the truth. You cannot mourn someone cleanly when you are still sorting out who they actually were. What I can tell you is that my son came to see me 3 weeks after the funeral. He drove up on a Saturday morning, and he sat in my kitchen, and he did not look like a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say. He looked like a man who was ashamed. He told me that after his father's death, he had found documents in a desk drawer correspondence, account statements, a folder of records his father had kept that confirmed everything I had told him and more. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once. I told him I knew. I told him I had never stopped loving him. Not for a single day of those 8 months. And that the hardest thing I had done throughout the whole of it was not fight his father in court. It was not call my son and say, "I told you so." He stayed for dinner. He has come back every month since. Carol came to stay with me the following spring. We spent a week going through the house together. Not the house I shared with my husband, which I had moved out of during the settlement process, but the small house I had bought for myself outside of Yellow Springs, with a garden that was badly overgrown and a back porch that needed new boards. Carol is not a gardener, and she is not a carpenter, but she came anyway. We pulled weeds and drank iced tea and talked for hours the way sisters talk when they have been keeping each other alive through something. On the last morning before she drove back to Columbus, we planted a rose bush along the south wall of the garden. Carol had brought it from her own yard, a cutting from a bush our mother had planted decades ago. We dug the hole together and settled the roots and pressed the soil down firmly, and Carol said, "There. Now, something of hers is here too." I think about that rose bush often. I think about what it means to plant something, to press the roots into new ground and believe that it will hold. I spent 44 years tending something I thought belonged to both of us equally. And I was wrong about the belonging part, but I was not wrong about the tending. The work was real. The mornings were real. The years were real. I am 73 years old. I have a garden and a back porch and a sister who calls me every Sunday. I have a daughter who drove 4 hours last Thanksgiving just to cook with me in my kitchen. And a son who is learning, slowly and honestly, how to look at the truth of what his father did without flinching away from it. I am not going to tell you that what happened to me made me stronger, because I think that framing asks too much of the people it happens to. What I will tell you is that I am still here, and that being still here, on the other side of all of it, is something I do not take for granted. There is a question I have been asked by my daughter, by Carol, by the few close friends I told the full story to. They ask whether I would have done anything differently if I had known, whether I would have watched the paperwork more closely, demanded joint signatures on every filing, insisted on being listed everywhere my name deserved to be listed. I have thought about this for a long time. The honest answer is that I don't know. Trust is not a failure of intelligence. Believing in the person you have built your life with is not carelessness. What I know is that I could not have loved him the way I did, and also suspected him the way I should have. Those two things could not have existed in the same person at the same time. And I was, for better and for worse, someone who loved fully. What I would tell a younger woman sitting where I once sat, not the version of me who was already 73 and reading a letter from a Cincinnati law office, but the version who was 40 or 50 or even 60, still building something and still believing in the person beside her. What I would tell her is this: know your name. Know where it is written and where it is not written. Know the structure of what you have built together. Not because you expect betrayal, but because what is yours deserves to have your name on it. That is not cynicism. That is not distrust. That is the other half of love, the part that says, "This is mine too, and I will not pretend otherwise." The rosebush bloomed for the first time last May. Small, yellow flowers, the same ones our mother grew. Carol sent me a photo of hers to compare, and they were identical, which made us both cry a little on the phone. She still calls, every Sunday. Some things, at least, were always exactly what they appeared to be.